I'm Rit Udison, Executive and Artistic Director at the Loft Literary Center. Welcome to this live stream at Virtual Wordplay. I'm so glad you're here with us. Before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about what brought us here today. For the last year, the Loft staff has been working hard to put together an outdoor book festival that would have gathered 100 authors with 10,000 visitors in our neighborhood in downtown Minneapolis. As COVID-19 hit, we knew we had to think about everything we do differently, especially this festival. While we were disappointed that we wouldn't be able to gather in person, we became even more committed to supporting writers, celebrating new books, and finding new ways to assert the connective power of the written word. In a time of anxiety, we want to offer a powerful event for readers, writers, and booksellers. When we first approached our sponsors, their first question was, what is a virtual festival? And to be honest, we didn't know. Our founding partners, St. Catherine University and Star Tribune, agreed to make a leap of faith with the Loft. With courage, generosity, and vision, they have worked alongside us to figure out what this virtual festival might become. We are grateful to our sponsors and donors. Their generosity is incredible, but it is not enough. We believe it is essential, especially during a health and financial crisis, to offer programs that are free and accessible to all. But that has led to a significant revenue loss. A live event would have included ticket revenue, beer sales, exhibitor fees, and additional sponsorships. The Loft is not closed. We continue to offer classes, fellowships, conversations, support for readers and writers in addition to this festival. We are here to support the literary community, and we ask that you continue to support us. If you are able, please consider making a contribution to the Loft today. Thank you for being here.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Lost Wordplay Uncharted territory with Claire Comstock-Gay, today featuring Clare Beams. My name is Abby and I'm with the Loft Literary Center. Before we get started, we wanted to take a moment to thank Wordplay's presenting sponsors, St. Catherine University and Star Tribune. They are the reason we can make this happen, so thank you. While all Loft Wordplay events are free, if you'd like to support the Loft's programming, you can do so by clicking the support button below. And conveniently also using that button, you can buy both of our Claire's books today. So Claire Comstock-Gay's book, Madame Clairevoyant's Guide to the Stars, comes out next week. You can pre-order it today from our friends at Majors and Quinn. You can also buy Clare Beams' book, The Illness Lesson, from Majors and Quinn as well. We also will be releasing next week's Wordplay programming after this event, so be sure to check loftwordplay.org to see what's coming next. And with that, I want to turn it over to the people you actually tuned in to see, Claire and Claire. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Abby. Hi, Claire. Thank you so much for coming on and talking with me today.
Well, thank you so much for having. I'm just so excited to talk to you.
I'm so excited to talk to you. I read your book this week and loved it so much. And I really, I'm just thrilled that we get to talk about it. So before we get to the astrology side, can you describe your book to us briefly?
Sure. So it is set in 1871 Massachusetts. And at the outset of the book, we have this aging philosopher, Samuel Hood, who's kind of outlived his fame. And his adult daughter, who has spent her whole life living with him and kind of tending the embers of that fame, is our main character. And they decide that they're going to start a school for young women to sort of make the point to the world that girls can do all the things that boys can do. And things, very quickly start to go wrong. That's sort of it in a nutshell.
Go extremely wrong, I would say.
Very, very wrong, yes.
So let's see. So astrology-wise, before we get into the real book stuff, can you tell me about your relationship to astrology? Do you believe in it? Do you hate it? Are you somewhere in between?
So I definitely don't hate it. I also have not historically been a huge believer. But I do think that sort of the various systems we use to organize the world and our relationship to it are very interesting. And I think that those frameworks are always useful. So I would say like pretty ill-informed about astrology. And I also I'm not a very, about almost everything in my life except the writing of fiction, I am not a very mystical person. So I'm pretty sort of pedestrian, like feet on the ground kind of person, except that I do think there are things that happen when you're writing and when you're reading too that are sort of not totally rational. So I guess I would say I am sort of not very knowledgeable is where I would put my.
That's very diplomatic of you. Thank you. No, but I get it. And I think there's a lot of reasons not to love astrology, right? Like there are a lot of different ways that it's presented to us. And some of them are cool. And some of them are like, oh my gosh, stop telling me what to do. Right.
Right. And I guess like sort of, well, maybe it's because I'm a Leo too, and I feel like some of the stuff you read about Leos just makes it makes us sound very, very obnoxious. And I think like, well, there's nothing at all I can do to change about, I can't change when I was born. So I guess I'm just always stuck with this like obnoxious description of myself.
That was actually going to be my next question, was to ask you like what you feel about being a Leo.
I think like most of what I've read is like that it just makes Leos sound like the sort of person who wants to take up all the air in a room, and so like, I mean, I hope I'm not like that. I've been like a very shy person to be for most of my life, but yeah, so that's like sort of my basic sense of Leos. And I probably like in the way that we tend to do, like you read it and you sort of absorb the stuff that's negative, maybe more than the stuff that's positive.
Sure. Well, and I think with Leos in particular, right, the negative stuff is like so fun to talk about because it's so big and bombastic and dramatic, right? And so a lot of the descriptions do, I think, focus on that stuff because it's like fun to be like, oh God, like these Leos, right? And I think for writers in particular, certain of the signs, they're so much not the types of things that we want to value about ourselves, right? Yeah. Like we're smart, we're deep, we're thoughtful, and then it's like, no, you're a Leo and you want the drama only all the time.
I care about other people. Like I really do.
Yeah. Yeah, so we've kind of talked about what the main Leo traits are, right? Dramatic, loves the spotlight, loves everyone's attention all the time. Are there other ones?
That's sort of the basic, like that's my takeaway. Yeah, which has always felt sort of funny to me because I mean, I guess like I get very nervous when in the spotlight, like when personally in the spotlight. I mean, I guess I do write books and then like sort of put them into the world, which is a sort of attention grabbing thing to do, I suppose. Like it doesn't feel that way during like the 7 years of quiet it takes to make the thing that you're putting into the world. But yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because it's like, there's a reason that we're not actors, right? Yeah. But there's also a reason that we're not accountants or something either, right? Like we want a little bit of the attention, but not maybe that, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think just to talk about Leo a little bit, maybe more generously, right? I think what gets lost sometimes is how warm Leo is as a sign. Right, we talk about like the hot Leo, right? But not so much the like really kind, fun to be around warm Leo. And I think that's part of it too. And that's something I feel like just talking with you over Zoom right now, it's like, oh yeah, warm energy. Here's the Leo.
Very nice. I can get behind that,
And I think Leo's really creative also. Right, I think fire signs in general, sometimes we think more about the like varying like metaphorical fieriness, when really at heart fire signs are about creation, right? They're about creating things in the world. And so even if you're not a fiery person, you can still have like that real strong fire sign energy. I think Leo also, right, what gets talked about a lot in my experience is like the bossiness.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, that's just leadership, right? Like there's always the give and take.
Yes.
And so I do wonder kind of whether from any of these things or just in your experience generally, are there Leo traits that you've heard of that have felt true to you? Or
I mean, certainly the bossiness or to describe it more generously, leadership. Like, I mean, I taught high school English for 6 years.
Oh, okay.
And I found that like once I settled in, it felt very natural to me to be the one who was like, and now get out your books, So, and I found, I'm a parent now of a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old. And I think my older daughter and I, sometimes we have some conflicts that have to do with both of our wanting to make the plan. I do love a plan. And I love to be the one making a plan, and so does she. And so sometimes that, so I think that there are certainly things about everything that you're saying that feel true.
I wonder too, and maybe you don't know the answer to this, and that's fine. Like, have you ever heard of other signs and you're like, oh, that's the sign that I feel like I am, right? Often I'll hear someone like, well, I'm an Aries, but I think I'm really a Capricorn.
Yeah,
has there ever been anything like that?
Not well informed enough to really know. I mean, like whenever you see something sort of like nice sounding in the other sides, you're like, oh, I'm a good listener. But yeah, I don't know.
Cool. Yeah. Well, so let's turn to your chart now. Obviously, anyone who's watched this show last week or who knows about astrology knows this, but for people who are watching who maybe don't know, right? Astrology is not only your sun sign. You also have a sign for all of the rest of the planets. There's 9 of them total, including kind of unscientifically the moon is a planet and Pluto is a planet. And so what's nice about astrology, right, is when your sun sign doesn't seem to really fit, or when there's kind of holes or gaps, there are all these other planets that might bring some nuance to it or explain some things that were left out. So what I want to talk about to start for your chart, which is, again, just really fun to read these books through the lens of astrology, because it's like, oh yeah, this is the chart of the illness lesson. Like, yep, this is it. But so I want to start talking about the big 3. That's kind of what astrologers call the main 3 like guideposts in a chart. That's your sun sign, your moon sign, and your rising sign.
Okay.
Have you gotten a reading before? Have you?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. That's exciting. So your sun is Leo. Your moon sign is Taurus.
Okay.
And your rising sign is Libra.
Okay.
And so the moon is kind of the sign of feelings, emotions. It's like your inner life sign. And Taurus, I really love Taurus. It's an earth sign. It's really like the earthiest one of the earth signs in a lot of ways, right? It's all about like enjoying your physical life and being comfortable and being solid and steady. And so it can indicate kind of an internal steadiness. It can also indicate like a real emotional stubbornness in a nice way. Right, which everything, there's like the good parts and the bad parts.
Right.
But I mean stubbornness in a very good way. When I talk about Taurus, I think it's a real strength.
Okay, great.
The rising sign, like mechanically, it's a little bit hard to explain. It's the sign that was rising over the Earth's horizon when you were born.
Okay.
That doesn't really matter so much as the fact that it's the sign of like your public face to the world. And so that can mean kind of, if you feel like often in public you're playing a role a little bit, or you're not acting your true self, you're acting like with a mask on, that can be your rising sign. Or if you just feel like you're extra on in public in a way that you're not at home, that can be your rising sign too. And so yours is Libra, which is like the sign of kind of beauty and aesthetics and balance. It's like the most beautiful one of the signs. It's really in a lot of the like older astrology books that kind of drive me crazy, just because they say some strange things, but they're always like, you'll notice a Libra out on the street because they're so beautiful. It's like, okay, this weirds me out. The point is, right, that it's just the sign that cares about beautiful things and balance and all of these.
Okay.
Things.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
I like feel like my public facing like, I don't know, sort of, I mean, I guess if it's sort of like the outdated books version of things, it's not really been my experience of my life, but you know, but whatever.
So I wonder, right, because there's another big part of Libra. It's symbolized by the scales.
Okay.
And so kind of as an indicator of like a real focus on not just balance, but like fairness and justice too.
Okay.
I wonder if that feels more,
Yeah,
or still not so much. Yeah.
I don't really feel like presenting like a beautiful face to the world has been like a big strength in my life, but like a fairness I can get behind.
Well, it's funny because I feel like your book was so beautiful, right? Like the language, the sentences, like the experience of reading it, right? Like it felt very elegant, very lovely, not just the bigger structure, but like on the language level, right? Like it's a beautiful book.
And that, I mean, I have to say like that I care about really a lot in writing, like, and to a point where it doesn't always help me. Like I get far too attached to sentences far too quickly and leave like major gaping structural holes and like character development holes for a really long time in the drafting process. But I'm like, don't you move that comma, you know? So yeah, so that in terms of that makes sense. Yeah.
I love that also. I don't know if you watched last week, we talked a little bit about how I think the Mercury sign is a really interesting sign to talk about with writers specifically, because that's the sign of like communication and thought and how you express yourself. And your Mercury sign is in Virgo, which is like the detail-oriented sign. Okay. And so I love like,
yeah,
if there's any sign that's gonna get worked up over a comma placement, right? Yeah. Mercury in Virgo.
That makes sense.
I also really like just Libra for you here, right? Because I think your book is really concerned with fairness and justice in a lot of ways, right? Like not just the balance, but really what is just in the world and how do we manage that in a world that's not fair, right?
Right. Yeah. No, I think that is true. Yeah.
Was that something that you had in mind, like as you set out to write the book, or?
I actually try, this is something I had to sort of learn as a writer. I almost have to try not to have like big picture stuff, like sort of thematic messaging in mind too early, because I am someone who can get very attached to a plan to a point where I kind of have killed the life in the actual fiction, you know? So I try, and this is sort of what I meant when I said, like, I'm not mystical about anything except fiction. Like I try really hard not to be too rationally aware of what I'm doing for some stretch of time, just to like allow for enough complication and weirdness to kind of get its way in there.
Yeah.
Because I think for quite a while as a writer, I really didn't make the space for that because I was trying to sort of control it all too much.
Yeah, that makes sense. But so back to your big three, something interestingly to me, I'm going to get a little bit deep into astrology, I guess, right now. But right, so each one of the signs is like ruled by a planet.
Okay.
That just means that the planet kind of like shades its energy a little bit, right? And so Libra, your rising sign, and Taurus, your moon, are both ruled by the same planet. And that planet is Venus.
Okay.
Which, again, something I like in astrology is we can kind of have an intuitive sense of a lot of these things, just because of kind of our cultural world that we're steeped in, right? Like if I asked you to say what you think Venus is about, you could probably guess it, right? It's like beauty, right? It's like love, it's beauty. But it's also, and I think this gets lost some, it's also values and what we value.
Okay, yeah.
And so I wonder, we talked a little bit about this just now, but I see a lot of that in your book, right? It's a lot of different people with different value systems and trying to figure out their values kind of crashing up against each other in a very small space, right? Is that fair, do you think?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to say too much. Everyone should read it, please. It's so good. And then I saw also you have Venus again. You have such a heavy Venus chart, which I think is really just wonderful. So there's a placement called the Midheaven, which is basically what it is kind of it's about your like public, not public face, right, but like your mission in life, your goals, your professional achievements that you're aiming for. And so for you to have Venus right on there, it makes a lot of sense that you're a writer writing these interesting, beautiful books, right? And that's your professional.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
So I want to ask you about, and this is going a little bit away from astrology, but I'm interested. And you mention it a bit at the end of the book, Little Women.
Yeah. Yeah.
Was that something that all along, were you thinking about Little Women as you wrote the book?
I mean, I think Little Women, I loved it so much as a kid that I think it's just sort of steeped into my way of processing the world. And actually, like, to go back to this idea of like sort of sorting ourselves and like kind of thinking about categories of self, like I think that part of what drew me about that book as a kid was the way those four sisters are such different types of people. And sort of like, you can't read that book without thinking like, oh, I'm like this, and my friend is like this, and my sister's like that, you know. So it sort of there's something irresistible about that, I think, that kind of like that way of understanding yourself by sort of comparing against types. So I think that I always loved that book. And when I found myself living in Massachusetts as an adult, I went to go see Orchard House, which is where the girls grew up, and Fruitlands, which is where Bronson Alcott tried to establish a commune when when Louisa May and her sisters were small. So this was right after I'd stopped teaching high school English I had been in the classroom for 6 years, and we were going to be moving, but we didn't know at what point and where. And so I had sort of left the classroom while we figured out where we were going. And I was also pregnant with my older daughter. And so I knew that I wanted to write a book about teaching, but I also, the kinds of contradictions that, so I went to Fruitlands and was wandering around, and it was a place that was sort of ruled by these beautiful ideas, all of these sort of theories that everyone should be equal and that all souls have sort of equal weight and equal value, including the souls of women. And yet, like, there was all this kind of almost comically like short-sighted practical thinking, like they were going to be fruitarians, so they were going to eat like what the earth freely gave, but like they didn't know how to do that nutritionally, and they didn't know how to farm, and it was cold, and like they almost froze and almost starved, and so like the commune had to end. And also I had started to be very aware, I think, in the course of sort of making a professional life for myself and just kind of moving through the world as a woman, of like the ways in which so I think with those transcendentalist thinkers, there are all these women like bustling around the edges, making a lot of that beautiful thinking possible in ways that are not totally acknowledged, even if the thinking itself should acknowledge them, you know? And I think we're not done with that. And so I think I was interested in a situation that would sort of let me explore those contradictions to some extent. So I think Little Women was always there, in terms of, you know, when you read that book now, I still love it, but like the way the father sort of swoops in with this moral weight is hard to read in some ways. He's this like benevolent figure in the book, but if you don't agree with him, you're wrong, you know. And that I think is a problem. If you're yeah.
Do you have a preferred movie version?
I saw the most recent one with my daughter, and for some reason, like, cried through the whole thing, and it was very unsettling to her. She also, it does so much skipping around in time that she kept going, like, she sat through the whole thing and was totally great about it, but she kept going, is this the present or are we in the past? And I was like, well, they're all alive, so you know we're in the past. But so I don't know, I found it very like visually beautiful and very sort of moving. I grew up loving the Winona Ryder one, but I also grew up kind of, because I loved the book so much, resisting like any image of it in some ways. The same way that I think like any book cover is a little hard for a writer, even no matter how much you love it, and I adore mine, but it's like the first time you see like the face that your book will have. Your book had like, it didn't have a defined face in that way in your head until you see it. And I think that can be hard with movie versions of books that you know very well, you know.
Something I loved, the new version is directed, obviously, right, by Greta Gerwig, also a Leo.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I'm in good company. movie.
True, and I think it really makes sense in a nice way, right? Like, I don't know, something about kind of taking this narrative and being like, no, I want to shape it in another way now, right? Let's see what it looks like.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so on that note, could you read to us a little bit from your book?
I thought I would just read like the first 2 pages of the book.
Great.
That seems like a good length. So since this is the first 2 pages, there's really not a lot you need to know. Like if there were more you needed to know, I should have put it in here. But you should know that we're in a fictional town called Ashwell in Massachusetts, and that the year is 1871. And this is just the beginning of the first chapter, but the first chapter is called Birds Again. The first of the birds Caroline mistook for her own mind's work. When the streak of red crossed the kitchen window pane, fast, disastrous bright, she thought it was some bloody piece come loose inside herself. Then her father appeared from the study and held the door frame, leaning in. Caroline, did you see? They found it in the yard, real after all, high in their birch tree, pecking judiciously at the bark. The size of a dove, the shape of a crow, and a brazen crimson tip to tail feathers, the shade a cardinal might bloom to if dipped in wine. It had a crestless head, all sharp planes. As the hoods watched, it took a choosy bird step forward, then craned neck over back to root around in its wing. No question at all, Samuel Hood said. His hand on Caroline's arm felt slight. This shock had dislodged his usual serenity, and in his face she saw old age, the way his features would fold in on themselves. To brace them both, she gripped his fingers. Trilling hearts, who'd have believed? A trilling heart, Caroline said. She had just one hazy red-tinged memory of the trilling heart's only prior appearance in Ashwell, 25 years earlier, standing barefoot in the grass of the front garden, 4 years old and afraid to go down the path because of the bird that stood guard there, chopping up a worm with its brutal beak. Snip, 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 worm bits on the gravel. On the steps behind her, sewing in the sun, her mother. What can this mean, her father asked. That there's a red bird in our tree. Samuel put a hand to his shirt front. When he was a boy, his appendix had almost burst before the surgeon managed to remove it, and in moments of great excitement, a heat and pain phantom seemed to revisit him. Sometimes Caroline found him with his fingers pressed there while he wrote, and knew he was imagining readers, roomfuls of them, schools of hands turning reams of his pages. There is some significance, he said. The immensities of God's creation often whittled themselves down to make a message for her father. But in this, wouldn't anyone read meaning? The red flash, the answering thrum. You know it was your mother who named them, Samuel said, as if speaking about a person who'd stepped into another room. Caroline tried again to turn her 4-year-old head, to leave off staring at the bird and catch sight of her mother's face. You never told me, she said. I must have. Well, when we first saw them, a group of us out walking in the afternoon, just happening upon them in the fields, you can't imagine. She said they put her in mind of hearts, scooped right out of chests. Disembodied, trilling hearts, she said. The bird's shape was wrong for this description, but its feel was right. The trilling heart looked like something safer left hidden. Do you think David will be here in time to see? Samuel said. As always, David's name sounded louder than the rest of the words. And I must tell Hawkins, I'll write him today. Hawkins will know if there have been others spotted. He's told me nothing grows or flies or runs in Massachusetts without his permission. Caroline hadn't seen George Hawkins or any of the Birch Hill men in years, but she could picture the set of his mouth in delivering this not quite jest. He was a physician, only an amateur naturalist, but the sort of man who never considered himself an amateur at anything. They all were. The bird raised its head again. Its black eye had the sightless sheen of a drop of oil. It tossed some bit of bark or insect back and swallowed it down, muscular throat squeezing. I ought to send a drawing with the letter. Caroline, would you? You have a fine hand. She breathed in on the swell of pride that came when her father praised her and stared at the bird to memorize it so that in the drawing itself she might earn that praise again. She noted the shape of the head, the shining, sharp-looking lines of the wings, the beak like a long, cruel tooth, the sweep of the tail feathers, that red, improbable shade. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, well, so I think that's it. Claire's amazing book, The Illness Lesson, is available from Majors and Quinn. I think you should have a link on screen. And I will be back again next week with Alexis Coe, author of You Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington. And you can check out loftwordplay.org for future programming. Thank you again to sponsors St. Catherine University and Star Tribune. I'll see you next week. Claire.
Thank you so much, Claire. This was such a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.